had rented the cabin to get away from everything. Work, people, noise. I wanted quiet, real quiet. The cabin sat on the edge of a national forest, about 20 miles from the nearest town, down a winding dirt road that barely passed for a road. It was an old place, simple and small, with a covered porch, one main room, a wood stove, and a tiny bedroom in back. No internet, no cell signal. That was the point. When I first pulled up, the air was crisp, cold for early fall. The cabin sat nestled among tall pine and fir trees, their trunks straight and narrow, shooting up into a sky that was more gray than blue. A pile of cut firewood sat under the porch. Everything smelled of sap, damp earth, and that sharp edge of coming winter. I liked it immediately. The first day passed quietly. I unloaded my gear, lit a small fire in the stove, and settled in. My plan was to spend the next few days hiking, reading, maybe just sitting on the porch watching the trees. Nothing ambitious. I needed a break from ambitious. Late in the afternoon, I walked a few hundred yards into the woods, just exploring. No trail, no plan. The ground was soft with pine needles. Every now and then, a bird would call out, or a squirrel would chatter as it darted up a tree. The further I went, the quieter it got. Normal woods quiet, the kind that soaks into your bones and makes you feel small in a good way. I didn't bring a gun, just a good knife on my belt and a can of bear spray clipped to my jacket. I wasn't too worried. Black bears are usually skittish, and mountain lions, well, you hardly ever see them. But you know when they see you. That first evening, I cooked on the little gas stove inside the cabin. Something about simple food tastes better out in the woods. After dinner, I sat on the porch for a while as the sky went from gray to deep blue to black. There was no moon, just darkness pressing in, the trees like black pillars against a darker sky. I went to bed early. The woods make you feel like that. No reason to stay up when there's nothing but dark outside. I woke up sometime after midnight. No reason, just woke up. The cabin was dead quiet. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting a faint orange glow on the wooden walls. I lay there listening, and then I heard it, a soft crunch of something walking across the ground outside. Not the scratchy shuffle of a raccoon, not the light, darting steps of a fox. This was heavier, measured, each step deliberate. I stayed still, my breathing slow, my ears strained for every sound. Another step, then another. It was moving along the side of the cabin. Slow, unhurried, the sound of something confident, something not worried about being seen. The boards of the porch creaked. I thought of my bear spray sitting on the table by the front door. Close, but not close enough to grab without moving. The steps crossed the porch. Then silence. I got up slowly, moved quietly to the window, careful not to let the old floorboards creak under my feet. I pulled back the edge of the curtain just an inch. For a few seconds, I saw nothing. Then it moved. A large shape, low to the ground, gliding silently just beyond the edge of the porch. At first, my brain wanted to say it was a dog, a big dog, but the way it moved wasn't right for a dog. Too smooth, too quiet. Mountain lion. It passed under the edge of the porch light. For just a second, I saw its body, lean muscle, long tail twitching low behind it. It was bigger than I expected. Solid, silent. Its head moved slowly, scanning. It knew I was in there. I backed away from the window. My mouth was dry, my heartbeat loud in my ears. There was no phone to call for help, no neighbors to yell for, just me, thin cabin walls, and that cat. I moved to the front door and slid the bolt across. Not much, but it was something. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. Then a thud against the wall. Not hard, not like an attack. More like it had leaned its weight against the cabin, testing it, seeing if it could get a response. I didn't move. My hand rested on the can of bear spray, thumb ready to pop the safety cap. But I didn't open the door. That would be stupid. The sound stopped again. I couldn't hear anything, but that didn't mean it was gone. Mountain lions are ambush predators. They don't charge in headfirst. They wait, they stalk, they test you. I sat back down in the old wooden chair by the stove, staring at the front door. I stayed there for what felt like hours. At some point, the sky started to lighten, shifting from black to a dull steel gray. I didn't hear it leave. When I finally worked up the nerve to open the door, the air outside was cold. The ground was wet from a light frost. I stepped onto the porch slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, but the prints were there. Large, round, with no claw marks. Cats keep their claws retracted when they walk. The tracks circled the cabin, close to the walls, following the edge of the porch. They were fresh, sharp. It had been right there, just a few feet from where I sat behind thin wooden walls. I didn't go far from the cabin that day. I kept to the porch, bear spray always within arm's reach. The forest felt different now. Not threatening exactly, more like it was watching. Like I had lost the safety of being an invisible guest. I thought about leaving, packing up, driving back to town. But a part of me felt like that would be running away. I wasn't doing anything wrong. This was public land. And besides, I told myself maybe it had just been passing through. A fluke encounter. But mountain lions don't fluke. They are deliberate. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going, kept the bear spray in my lap. I sat by the window listening. Hours passed. The night stretched on. And then it came back. I didn't hear it at first. Not until it was already close. Another soft thump against the wall. Like a reminder. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, from the side window, movement. A shape passing by, slow and low. The same long tail. The same deliberate steps. It circled the cabin again, pausing now and then. Testing. I felt the thinness of the walls more than ever. This place was built to keep out rain and wind. Not a determined predator. I didn't know what it wanted. Food? Curiosity? Was it sizing me up as prey? Or just making sure I knew whose woods these were? I never found out. As suddenly as it had come, it was gone again, melting back into the trees without a sound. The next morning, I made my choice. I packed up, quietly, methodically, no panic, just steady movements. I didn't want to leave in a rush, didn't want to feel like I was fleeing. But I wasn't stupid. That mountain lion wasn't going to stop coming back. Not after 2 nights. It knew I was here. It had tested the cabin, tested my reactions. And it wasn't afraid. I left the cabin before noon, locking the door out of habit even though it wouldn't matter to a lion. The drive back to town was long. The dirt road seemed narrower. Every shadow between the trees felt like it was watching me go. When I finally reached the paved road, I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Back in town, the noise and people felt strange, overwhelming, safe. I never went back to that cabin. The memory stuck with me, though. The quiet of its steps. The way it circled without hurry. How it knew I was in there, thin walls between us, and didn't care. Out there, in the wild, you're not in control. You're not at the top. You're just another animal. And sometimes, something bigger, stronger, and more patient decides to remind you. I went up to the cabin to get away from people. I do that sometimes when life feels like it's closing in. Work piles up. Phone never stops buzzing. Everyone wants something. The cabin doesn't want anything from me. It's just there, quiet. This cabin wasn't fancy. No running water, no power. Just 4 walls, a tin roof, and a wood stove that creaked when it got hot. I owned it. My grandfather built it back in the 70s, before things got crowded out here. He picked a spot way off the beaten path. You had to drive 20 miles of logging road just to get close, and from there, hike in the last half mile with a pack. Some people like cabins with all the comforts of home. Not me. I liked how this place made you work. Chop wood, haul water, cook over a fire. It slowed everything down. I went up in mid-October. The air had that sharp bite in the mornings, but no snow yet. Trees were already bare. The leaves had come down early that year. The ground was a soft mess of wet leaves and black dirt. The sky was low, all gray and heavy. First thing I did when I got there was walk the perimeter. Just habit. Check for any damage. Trees dropping branches. Critters chewing through something. The cabin stood solid, same as always. The door was stiff but opened with a good shoulder push. Inside, it smelled like cold wood and old smoke. I spent the first few hours getting the stove going, chopping kindling from a stack of split logs. The forest was quiet. You get used to that stillness. No cars, no people, just the occasional raven calling from up high, or a squirrel chittering because you got too close to its stash. By late afternoon, I was settled in. Had a pot of water heating for coffee. Sitting on the porch with my boots kicked up, watching nothing in particular. That's when I noticed it. Not a sound at first, just a feeling, like the woods had paused. The birds stopped. No squirrels, just dead air. Then, from the tree line about 50 yards out, movement. Slow, heavy, a bear. Black bear, probably a male. Big. He wasn't in a hurry, just lumbering along, nose to the ground. He was close enough that I could see the way his fur rippled with muscle. He wasn't a little garbage bear you see near campsites. This was a real forest bear. I stayed still. Bears usually don't want trouble. Give them space, they move on. But this one didn't. He kept coming. Not straight at me. More like a slow arc, casual but closing the distance. His nose kept working, swinging side to side. Wind was wrong. He couldn't smell me yet. But he was curious. His path was going to bring him right up to the cabin. I didn't want that. I stood up slow. No sudden moves. Picked up a metal pot from beside the woodpile and banged it hard with a hatchet handle. The sound cracked out sharp in the still air. The bear stopped, lifted his head, looked right at me. For a long second, nothing happened. Then he kept coming. No bluff charge, no huffing, just that same slow, steady pace. His head low again, but now he had me locked in. That's when my gut told me this wasn't a normal bear. I backed toward the cabin door. Quiet, no panicking. I knew better than to run. I grabbed my bear spray from the porch table as I went. My rifle was inside, unloaded. Dumb mistake. The bear reached the clearing around the cabin. Maybe 20 yards out now. He stopped again. This time, he swayed his head slow side to side, testing me. I racked the bolt on the rifle as fast as I could once inside. The sound felt too loud. I had it loaded, safety on, barrel pointed down. I didn't want to shoot him, not unless I had no choice. But this wasn't looking good. Through the front window, I watched him move up to the porch steps. He sniffed the bottom step, pawed at it. His claws made a hollow thudding sound on the wood. He stood up on his hind legs, putting his front paws on the edge of the porch. For a moment, he was huge, towering, his snout working the air. I was 10 feet from him, just inside the door, rifle up. I yelled once, a loud, sharp shout. He dropped down but didn't run, padded slowly to the side of the cabin. I could hear his heavy steps, feel them through the floor. He was circling, testing. That's when I realized this bear had done this before. He wasn't curious. He wasn't scared. He was seeing how far he could push. He spent the next 15 minutes circling the cabin, pawing at the walls, sniffing the ground. He tested the back window, standing up to nudge it with his shoulder. Luckily, that window had shutters, heavy ones. I could hear his breathing when he was close, deep, steady. I stayed inside, rifle ready, bear spray on my belt, waiting. Eventually, he wandered off, not in a hurry, just drifted back into the trees like he'd lost interest. But I knew better. That night was the longest night I can remember. I didn't light any lamps, just sat by the stove in the dark, rifle across my lap, listening. Every creak of the wood, every pop of the stove made my ears twitch. Around midnight, I heard him come back. The sound of heavy steps outside, claws scraping wood. He was at the porch again. He didn't bother being quiet. He knew I was there. This time, he pushed harder. I heard the creak of wood as he leaned his weight against the door. He pawed at it, tested it. The bolt held. For now, he circled again, scratched at the shutters, snorted against the logs. I stayed still, finger near the trigger, safety off. He left again around dawn, faded into the trees with the same slow steps. I went outside that morning, rifle in hand. The porch was gouged with fresh claw marks. The ground was torn up where he'd paced. His prints circled the cabin in loops. This wasn't going to stop. Bears are smart, persistent. If they get a reward once, trash, food, anything, they remember, and they keep coming back. This one had learned somewhere that cabins give up food. Maybe not mine yet, but soon. That afternoon, I packed up. It wasn't fear. Not really. It was respect. You don't win staring contests with a bear that isn't scared of people. You just get hurt. I made the trip back to the truck slow and careful. Kept the rifle ready the whole way. Every snapping twig made my skin crawl. But I didn't see him. Back at the truck, I strapped my gear down and took one last look toward the trees. Nothing moved. Driving out, I thought about how quiet he had been. For an animal that big, he barely made a sound when he didn't want to. I've been lucky. Back home, the cabin felt far away, like a dream, but the claw marks were real. The weight of his steps, the quiet way the forest changed when he was near. I didn't go back for a long time after that. When I finally did, months later, it was deep winter. Snow everywhere. The cabin stood quiet under a heavy white blanket. No new damage, no fresh prints. But I knew he'd be back someday, because once a bear learns you're part of his map, he never forgets. And next time, he might not be so patient. I had been coming up to this old cabin for years. My uncle built it back in the 70s. Nothing fancy, just a simple, single-room structure tucked into the edge of the forest line, about 5 miles off a dirt road that only locals ever used. The cabin had no electricity, no plumbing, just a wood stove, some old furniture, and a bunk bed with lumpy mattresses that stank of old sweat and wood smoke. For me, that was perfect. That weekend, I needed to clear my head. Work had been rough. My phone had been going off constantly, emails stacking up, people breathing down my neck. I needed to be somewhere quiet, somewhere I wouldn't hear a damn thing except the wind in the trees. So Friday afternoon, I packed up the truck, grabbed enough food and water for a couple days, and made the slow, bumpy drive up to the cabin. By the time I got there, the sun was hanging low. That sharp, golden light slanting through the trees made everything glow. I got out, stretched my legs, took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine needles and cold dirt. No sounds but the rustle of leaves. No phone signal. Perfect. I went through the usual routine. Unlocked the padlock, pushed the creaky door open, knocked down a few cobwebs with a stick. A couple mice had been living under the sink, so I cleared that out too. Nothing unusual. I made a small fire in the stove, just enough to take the edge off the cold, then set up my cot by the window. Dinner was a can of chili, eaten straight from the can with a spoon. After that, I settled in with a lantern and a book. By 9, I was already half asleep. That first night was fine. A little windy. I heard some branches tapping against the roof, but nothing that bothered me. The second night was when things got strange. I had spent most of Saturday hiking the ridgeline, following deer trails, just enjoying the quiet. I didn't see much in the way of animals. Couple squirrels. Once I thought I heard a deer crashing through the brush, but it stayed out of sight. When I got back to the cabin around dusk, I noticed something weird. Feathers. They were scattered in the dirt around the cabin. Not a huge pile, just a few here and there. Black and gray, mottled with white. I figured maybe a hawk had nailed a smaller bird, or an owl had gone after something. Normal stuff. Still, it made me pause. I hadn't seen many birds at all that day. I brushed it off, cooked dinner, sat by the stove reading. By 10, I was turning in. That night, I didn't sleep well. It was around 2 in the morning when I woke up. Not fully awake, more like that half-aware state where you're still drifting. Something had pulled me out of sleep, though. A sound. Scraping. Not loud. A dry, scratchy sound, like claws on wood. Came again. Scrape, scrape. I lay still, holding my breath. The sound was coming from outside, near the window. Maybe a raccoon, maybe a porcupine. I tried to convince myself of that, but something didn't sit right. It wasn't the usual skittering you hear from small animals. It was slower, deliberate, almost like fingers, if that makes sense. But fingers don't scrape wood like that. I sat up slowly. My heart was going, but I kept telling myself not to be stupid. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack, clicked it on. The beam hit the window. Nothing there. The scraping stopped. I didn't go outside. Not in the middle of the night. I wasn't about to step into the dark woods chasing shadows. Instead, I sat there for a while listening. The only sound was the wind. Eventually, I laid back down. Sleep didn't come easy. The next morning was quiet. Normal, even. I half expected to find tracks around the cabin, or more feathers, but there was nothing. Just the cabin, the woods, and me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. It clung to me as I went about the day. I didn't go far, just gathered some firewood, checked the old water barrel out back, took it easy. Around noon, I noticed more feathers. This time, they were up in the trees. High up, clumps of dark feathers stuck to the branches. That wasn't normal. Hawks don't leave feathers stuck like that. Owls don't either. It looked like something big had hit those trees, or landed hard. I started to get that tight feeling in my stomach. The woods felt different, like I was being watched. Every crack of a branch, every shift of leaves put me on edge. I decided not to go hiking again. Instead, I stayed close to the cabin, keeping my back to the walls, eyes on the trees. The sun went down slow, but it felt fast to me. Shadows stretched out, swallowing the clearing. By the time it was dark, I had the fire going strong. Lantern lit, flashlight ready. I didn't read. I just sat there, listening. The wind picked up around 10. Not howling, but steady. The kind of wind that makes the trees groan. That was when I heard it again. Scrape, scrape. Same sound, same spot, right by the window. I clicked the flashlight on, pointed it at the glass. Nothing. But this time, the scraping didn't stop. Kept going. A slow, dragging sound against the wood, moving from the window towards the corner of the cabin. I stood up. The flashlight beam shook in my hand. I didn't go outside. Instead, I circled to the other side of the cabin, peeking through the opposite window. That's when I saw it. Not clearly, just the outline. A shape moving in the dark, low to the ground but tall, if that makes sense. Like it was hunched, and the way it moved, it wasn't right. The shoulders rolled too much. The arms, they were too long. Longer than they should have been. It moved past the window, slow, deliberate, scraping a hand. A claw, along the wall as it went. My throat was dry. My legs felt locked. The thing stopped at the corner of the cabin. I could hear it breathing. Not heavy, but steady. Like it wasn't in any rush. Like it knew I was in there and it was just waiting. I killed the lantern. Sat down on the cot. The fire in the stove kept a faint glow, but it was dim. I held the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. For the next hour, I listened. I heard it move. Not fast, just slow circles around the cabin. Scraping now and then, pausing, breathing. A couple times, it bumped the walls. Not hard, just enough to let me know it was there. I didn't sleep that night. By dawn, the sounds had stopped. When the gray light filled the cabin, I finally dared to look outside. Nothing, but the scratches were there. Long, shallow grooves along the wood siding. Too high for a raccoon, too deliberate for a bear. And more feathers, this time right by the door. Dark, greasy-looking things. I packed up fast, threw everything into the truck and got the hell out of there. On the drive back, I kept checking the rearview mirror. Every shadow between the trees felt like it was watching me. The cabin got smaller and smaller, but that feeling stuck with me. I haven't been back since. The weirdest part? A few weeks later, I mentioned the feathers to a guy at the hardware store, just offhand. He told me about these big birds that nest up in the ridges, carrion feeders, ugly things, but he said they don't usually come down that far. Said it was strange. I looked it up later, saw pictures of those birds. They were big, wingspans 6-7 feet, but none of them matched what I saw. None of them moved like that thing did. I don't know what it was. Could have been a big bird. Could have been something else. I'm not saying it was some monster. All I know is whatever it wasn't scared of me. It wasn't in a hurry, and it knew where I was sleeping. That's enough for me. I won't be going back. It was late October when I decided to spend a weekend alone at the cabin. This wasn't one of those luxury rentals you see on the internet. It was old, plain, and isolated. My grandfather built it by hand 50 years ago, deep in the woods of northern Maine. A place where you could forget the rest of the world existed. The cabin sat about 8 miles from the nearest dirt road, down an old logging trail that barely counted as a path anymore. No power lines, no cell service, no neighbors. Just trees, rock, and quiet. I'd been there plenty of times as a kid with my father, but this was my first solo trip. I wanted to clear my head. Life had been heavy. Work stress, family stuff, and the constant noise of phones and screens. I needed quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive. So I packed up my truck with the essentials: water, canned food, a camp stove, my rifle, and a few other things, and headed north. The air got colder as I drove. The trees stood bare, their leaves already carpeting the forest floor. It had rained the night before, so everything had that wet, earthy smell. I parked at the end of the trail and hiked in. The hike took about 2 hours, mostly uphill. The trail was overgrown, branches grabbing at my clothes, rocks slipping underfoot. It was exhausting, but I welcomed it. When I reached the cabin, it was just as I remembered. Small, dark brown from years of weather, with a tin roof that rattled in the wind. A little stone chimney on one side, a wooden deck on the front. No frills. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. Dust motes floated in the light from my headlamp. The air was cold and still, smelling of old wood and damp stone. I spent the first few hours getting settled. I swept out dead leaves and dirt, started a fire in the wood stove, and unpacked my gear. By nightfall, the cabin was warm and quiet. I made a simple dinner, just beans and bread, and sat on the deck, listening to the woods. No traffic, no people. Just wind in the trees and the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. It was peaceful, but not comfortable. There's a kind of tension in that much quiet. Every little noise feels sharper. You notice things you wouldn't in a busy place. The way the wind sometimes stops dead. The subtle difference between a branch falling and something stepping on it. I told myself it was just wildlife. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. Normal things. I went to bed early, but sleep was hard. The wind would kick up against the walls, making the old boards creak. Now and then, I'd hear faint noises outside, scratches, soft thuds. I kept telling myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But around 2 a.m., something heavy thumped against the side of the cabin. It wasn't loud. Not a crash, not violent. Just a single, solid thump. Like a large animal had brushed against the wall. I held my breath, listening. The fire had died down, so the cabin was dim. I could barely see across the room. The thump didn't repeat, but the silence that followed felt heavier. I didn't get up. I stayed in my sleeping bag, listening hard. After a while, the normal forest sounds returned. I convinced myself it was a bear passing by, maybe rubbing against the wall. I had my rifle close, and the doors were bolted. Still, sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, the world felt normal again. Cold, bright sunlight filtered through the trees. The woods looked harmless in daylight. I stepped outside to check around the cabin. The ground was muddy from the recent rain, and I was hoping to see tracks. I did see some, deer mostly, hoof prints near the treeline. I couldn't find anything that explained the noise from the night before. I spent the day cutting firewood, collecting kindling, and hiking a little further into the woods. The more I stayed busy, the less I thought about the thump. By the time the sun began to set, I was tired enough that sleep seemed possible. That night, I was woken again, not by a loud sound, but by a change. The wind had stopped, dead still, and in that stillness, I could hear something soft, a dragging sound. It was coming from outside, moving slowly along the side of the cabin. Not footsteps, not the light patter of a raccoon or fox. This was heavier, a slow, deliberate scrape. It moved from one wall to another, circling. My heart thumped harder with each pass. I sat up, reaching for my rifle. The cabin walls are thin, but thick enough to muffle small sounds. This wasn't muffled. Whatever it was right against the wall. I didn't want to open the door. That felt reckless. But I couldn't sit there doing nothing. I slipped out of my sleeping bag as quietly as I could. Every board creaked under my weight. I reached the window near the front door and slowly peeked out. The moon was out, casting just enough light to see shapes. That's when I saw it. At first, my brain said it was a large bird, maybe a heron or a crane. Tall, thin, with long legs and a thin neck. But then it moved. The way it shifted wasn't right. It was standing upright, but hunched. Its limbs seemed too long, too thin, like they had extra joints. It stepped forward in a slow, jerking motion, as if figuring out how to use its legs. The skin wasn't feathers. It was rough, patchy, bare in places like it had been plucked. The head was small compared to the body, with a narrow beak or snout. It moved along the wall, its head tilted, listening. Then it stopped right below the window. I dropped to the floor, heart hammering. I could hear it breathing, a slow, rattling breath, as if each inhale took effort. The cabin felt smaller, the air thinner. I held my rifle tight but didn't move. After what felt like hours, the scraping sound started again, moving away from the window around the back. Eventually, the normal night sounds returned. Crickets whined through the branches, but I didn't sleep. Morning came with relief. The sunlight made the fear feel distant, like a bad dream. But when I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. There were marks along the walls, long, shallow scratches, not from claws, but like something had dragged sticks or thin bones along the wood. The mud showed prints, but not ones I recognized. Long, narrow impressions, not hooves, not paws. I didn't have an explanation. Maybe a sick animal, some kind of large bird with a deformity. My brain tried to make sense of it, but a part of me knew this wasn't normal. I debated packing up and leaving, but stubbornness kept me there. This was my family's cabin. I wouldn't be chased out by some crippled bird, so I spent the day fortifying. I nailed boards across the windows, reinforced the door with extra beams from the woodpile. I kept my rifle loaded and close. Night fell again. I sat by the fire, staring at the door. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees. Hours passed. Nothing happened. No dragging sounds, no breathing. Just the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. Then a sharp knock. Not a branch falling, not the wind. A single, deliberate knock on the front door. I didn't move. My mouth went dry. Another knock, louder this time. Slow, deliberate. It wasn't trying to break in. It was knocking. I raised the rifle, aimed at the door, but it never opened. The knocking stopped. Minutes passed, then an hour. I stayed awake the rest of the night, muscles tense, eyes fixed on the door. When the sun rose, the knocking felt like a distant memory. But when I stepped outside, there was a new mark on the door. A smear of something dark, like dried mud or old blood, trailing down from where the knocking had come. And in the soft ground, a new set of those strange impressions circling the cabin. I didn't stay a third night. I packed up quickly, glancing over my shoulder with every trip to the treeline. The woods felt too quiet. The usual morning sounds were absent. The hike back to the truck was tense. Every snap of a twig made me flinch, but I never saw it again. When I reached the truck, I looked back once more. The trees stood still. Nothing moved. The cabin was hidden by the forest, as if nothing had ever been there, as if the night had swallowed the whole thing. I never told anyone about what I saw, not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because I couldn't explain it myself. Maybe it was a sick animal, maybe something deformed by disease or starvation, but in my gut, I knew it was more than that. I haven't been back to the cabin since. I still think about it, sometimes late at night when everything's quiet. That slow scrape, the knock at the door, the breathing. Sometimes when the wind dies down and the house is still, I listen, just in case. It was late October when I decided to get away for a weekend. The weather was turning colder, leaves were halfway done falling, and the air had that sharp, dead smell of a coming winter. I had a buddy who owned a hunting cabin up north, tucked a few miles back into state forest land. He let me borrow it sometimes, told me I could use it whenever I needed to disappear for a while. That weekend, I wanted quiet. No phone, no people, just some space to think. I was tired of traffic, screens, noise, all of it. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just an old wood structure, barely insulated, with a wood stove and an outhouse about 30 yards away. No running water, no electricity unless you fired up a loud old generator, which I never did. I liked it silent. I left Friday afternoon, made the drive in a little over 3 hours. Most of it was highway, but the last 45 minutes were back roads, winding through dense woods and long stretches of empty farmland. The last mile was a dirt road so chewed up it forced you into a crawl. I parked where the path ended and walked the last 200 yards, backpack slung over my shoulder, rifle over the other, boots crunching through dry leaves. The cabin sat in a small clearing, just big enough to let a little sunlight through. On 3 sides, thick woods pressed right up against it. Old pine, maple, birch, all mixed together. The trees were close, the undergrowth was heavy, and the farther you looked, the darker it seemed. Inside, it smelled of cold wood and old smoke. Dust floated in the light beams. There was a small table, a couple chairs, and a bunk built against the far wall. The stove sat near the center. I opened the flue, crumpled newspaper, stacked kindling, and got a fire going. Soon enough, the metal groaned with heat, the cabin creaked, and that sharp wood smoke smell filled the air. I unpacked my gear slowly, set out some food, and sat for a while listening to nothing but wind outside. The first day passed easy. I didn't do much besides walk around, stretch my legs, take in the air. There was an old trail that looped about a mile out and back, marked by faded ribbons of orange plastic tied to tree branches. I followed it until sunset, just moving slow, keeping my eyes open for deer. I wasn't hunting that trip, but habits die hard. That night was clear, colder. The stars were bright and sharp. The wind rattled dry branches. I stayed up by the stove until late, then climbed into the bunk, wrapped in my sleeping bag, and let the cold outside hum against the cabin walls. It was sometime past midnight when I first heard it. A slow, steady crunching in the leaves. Not wind, not falling branches. Heavy, measured. Something walking, slow and deliberate. I propped myself up in the bunk, listening. It was coming from the woods behind the cabin, maybe 20 yards out. The sound would come, then stop. Silence. Then again crunch. Crunch. Like footsteps, but spread out, as if whatever it was would take a few steps, then pause. Listen, then move again. I thought it might be a deer. Wouldn't be strange out here. They move at night. But it was late, and something about the rhythm of it wasn't right. Felt intentional, focused. I kept still, breathing slow, letting my ears adjust. The fire had died down to a low glow, but it was enough to see the shadow outlines inside. The steps circled, first behind the cabin, then slowly moving along the side. Each time, crunch, pause, then another crunch. I didn't get up. I didn't look out the window. I've spent enough time in the woods to know sometimes it's best to wait, to listen, to not move until you're sure. Minutes passed. The steps faded away. The woods fell back into that empty, windy silence. After a while, I eased back down, closed my eyes, and told myself it was just a deer. Maybe a buck moving through. Maybe not even that. Just nerves, too much quiet after too much noise. But the next night, it happened again. Same time, same slow, deliberate steps. This time they came from the front, out near the treeline. I killed the lantern early, sat in the dark, listening. The steps were closer now, just beyond the clearing. A few steps, a pause, then more. I got the distinct sense I was being watched, that something out there knew I was inside, sitting quiet, listening back. This time, I stood up slow, took my rifle, and went to the window. I didn't flick on my flashlight, didn't make a sound. Through the glass, through the reflection of faint firelight, I looked out. For a long moment, I saw nothing but black trees and stars between the branches. But then, at the far edge of the clearing, something moved. It was standing just beyond the reach of the moonlight. At first, I thought it was a deer. The body shape was right, narrow chest, long legs, thin neck. But it wasn't moving like a deer. It was upright, 2 legs. It stood like a person would, arms hanging oddly low. Its head was narrow, too narrow, like a deer skull but without the bulk of the body you'd expect. The antlers weren't right either. They were small, malformed, almost like nubs or thick branches jutting out at sharp angles. It didn't move toward the cabin. It just stood there, swaying slightly. I could see breath fogging in the cold. Its legs seemed too long for its body, giving it a stretched, wrong look. The longer I stared, the more off it seemed, like it wasn't built to stand like that, but did it anyway. I didn't move. I didn't raise my rifle. Something deep down told me not to. I just watched, and after what felt like a full minute, it turned. Not with the grace of a deer bounding off, but slow, with jerky, awkward steps. It turned back into the woods and was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I checked for tracks. The ground was covered in leaves, but in a few spots where the dirt showed through, I found impressions. Hooves, but not where they should be. They were side by side, like footsteps. No stagger, no 4-legged pattern. Just 2 hooves lined up, spaced like human feet would be. The day felt wrong after that. The woods seemed quieter, heavier. I didn't walk far. I stayed near the cabin, keeping an eye on the treeline. Every now and then, I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of shape, a shadow shifting, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. That night, I didn't light a fire. I kept the cabin dark, sat in the corner with my rifle across my lap. The wind picked up, colder than before. The woods outside creaked and whispered, and then the steps came back. Crunch, pause, crunch, closer this time, coming straight up toward the front of the cabin. My pulse was loud in my ears. I kept still. Through the window, barely visible, the shape appeared again, standing at the edge of the clearing. Same thin, upright body, same jerky swaying. It tilted its head slightly, like it was trying to see through the dark glass. Took a step forward. My finger tensed on the trigger, but it stopped. And then, slow, it raised one of its long arms. The limb moved unnaturally, like it had too many joints. It reached up and tapped its own chest. Then it pointed at the cabin. At me. The motion was clumsy, stiff, but clear. It stood there for another moment, then turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't sleep at all that night. When dawn came, I packed my gear fast. I didn't bother with breakfast. Rifle slung, pack on. I started down the path toward the truck. Every few steps, I'd look back. The woods were still, too still. No birds, no squirrel chatter, just wind and empty trees. I made it to the truck without seeing it again. Drove fast down that dirt road, faster when the tires hit pavement. Didn't stop until the highway was under my wheels and the woods were far behind. But the image of it didn't leave. A deer on 2 legs, watching, listening, pointing. I haven't been back to that cabin since. My buddy asks sometimes why I don't go anymore. I just tell him I'm too busy. But the truth is, I know it's still out there. That thing wasn't right. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster from some story. It was real, flesh and blood, but broken, wrong. Something that shouldn't have been walking the way it was, shouldn't have been moving like a man. But it did. And I don't think it was curious. I think it was warning me, and I listened. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The city was wearing me down, grinding me thin with its noise and endless rush. Work, traffic, people everywhere. It all started to feel like a weight pressing on my chest. I needed out, even if only for a few days. A quiet place, deep in the woods, where I could breathe. My friend had a small cabin nestled in the middle of a state forest. It was nothing fancy, but it was perfect for disappearing. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a little propane lamp, and thick walls that kept the cold out. He gave me the keys and told me to treat it like my own. I drove there late on a Friday, hauling my pack and a cooler full of food. The road to the cabin was a dirt trail, bumpy and narrow, winding through dense pine and maple trees. As I drove deeper, the air grew cooler and crisper, the smell of earth and pine needles thick and clean. I parked near a small clearing and unloaded my gear. The cabin stood quietly, framed by tall trees that blocked out the sky. It looked untouched, like it had been waiting for me. Inside, the smell of old wood and damp earth welcomed me. Dust motes floated in the soft light coming through the windows. The walls were lined with rough wooden planks. The floor creaked underfoot. I set my bag down and started a fire in the wood stove. The dry wood cracked and sparked, and soon the cabin filled with warm, smoky air. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees. The first day passed quietly. I wandered the nearby trails, moving slowly, drinking in the silence. The forest felt alive but calm. Birds chirped softly, squirrels darted through the underbrush, and the occasional deer glanced at me before melting back into the woods. I wasn't hunting, I just wanted to be alone to think. That night, I fell asleep early, curled up near the fire. The cold air crept in around the edges of the door and windows, but the stove kept the room warm enough. Outside, the wind shifted and trees swayed, leaves rustling in a low, constant murmur. I slept with the window cracked open, letting the fresh forest air in. I woke sometime after midnight. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the cabin was quiet except for the faint sounds of the forest. But then I heard something else, a faint thudding noise. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but it grew louder and more rhythmic. Hud, hud, hud. Slow, deliberate. I got out of bed and moved cautiously toward the window. The moon was high and bright, casting silver light over the clearing. My breath fogged in the cold air as I peered out. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the moonlight, something stood. It wasn't a deer or a bear, and it wasn't human. It was a dog, but standing upright on two legs. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks. The creature was roughly the size of a large German shepherd, but it stood straight up, hips locked like a person's. Its fur was matted and patchy, a mix of dark brown and black, and its head tilted slightly as it watched me through the window. Its eyes caught the moonlight, golden and sharp, wide with an eerie intelligence. It didn't bark. It didn't growl. It just stood there, completely still except for its slow, steady breathing. The way it balanced perfectly on two legs was unnatural, almost impossible. The muscles in its legs looked thick and tense, as if built for walking upright. For a moment, I was frozen. I thought about reaching for my rifle, but something held me back. Fear, maybe, or disbelief. The dog's head slowly turned, eyes locked onto mine. Then it took a careful step forward. It moved with an awkward gait, like it was still learning how to walk this way. Each step was deliberate, measured. I watched it cross the clearing. Its front legs, what you would normally call its paws, hung at its sides, claws flexing softly. It moved closer to the cabin, each step echoing softly on the frost-covered ground. Then, at about 10 feet from the window, it stopped. The creature raised one of its front paws and tapped the glass lightly. Tap, tap. I swallowed hard, heart pounding in my chest. The sound was sharp and sudden in the quiet night. Then it turned its head away, as if satisfied, and stepped back toward the tree-line. The last thing I saw before it disappeared into the shadows was the way it moved, upright but jerky, like a man awkwardly trying to mimic an animal instead of the other way around. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, the clearing looked ordinary again. Empty, peaceful, covered in frost. I checked outside for tracks but found nothing unusual. Just paw prints, some deer tracks, and the scattered remnants of leaves. No sign of anything walking upright. That day, I kept close to the cabin. I didn't hike the trails as I had planned. Every rustle made me jump. Every shadow made me look twice. The forest seemed quieter somehow, like it was holding its breath. As evening fell, I started a fire again and tried to calm myself. I told myself I must have been tired or dreaming, that no animal could stand on two legs like that. Dogs don't walk like people. It must have been a trick of the light. But when night came, the noise returned. That slow, heavy thudding outside, moving back and forth around the clearing. I stayed inside, watching the windows, waiting. The creature came again. This time, it didn't just stand on two legs. It moved into the light of the moon, stepping awkwardly toward the cabin's door. I could see more clearly now. His face was a mix of dog and something else. The muzzle was long and narrow, but the eyes were too human. They held a strange, cold awareness. The ears twitched and flicked at sounds I couldn't hear. It raised itself fully upright and made a small sound, a low growl or maybe a bark, but the noise was hoarse and broken, almost like it was struggling. The creature's front limbs, which should have been paws, looked more like hands with curled fingers ending in claws. Its body was twisted and thin, fur missing in patches, scars visible along its ribs. Its chest rose and fell rapidly. It stepped close to the door and pressed its hands against the wood, scratching lightly, almost tentatively. I was paralyzed with fear. The logic in my mind clashed with what I saw in front of me. This wasn't just a strange animal. It was something else, something unnatural. I grabbed my rifle and crept quietly to the door. I didn't open it, but I wanted to see if it would stay or leave. The creature shifted, swaying on its legs, before turning back toward the trees. It disappeared into the darkness without another sound. I didn't sleep that night either. Over the next day, I tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was a dog hit by a car, badly injured but still alive and somehow standing upright. Maybe some kind of rare deformity or disease caused the strange posture. But none of it made sense. Dogs don't just learn to walk on two legs, not like that. The sun set fast, and I knew the creature would return. It was part of the woods now, part of that quiet, dark world I couldn't reach. That night, I stayed by the fire, rifle close, listening. The thudding came again, slow and steady. I didn't look out the window this time. I didn't want to see it. When morning came, I made my decision. I packed quickly, not bothering with the fire. My hands shook as I loaded my gear. I glanced around the cabin one last time, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Outside, the woods stretched dark and endless. I got in my truck and started down the rough dirt road without looking back. The forest was silent, but I knew the creature was still there, moving awkwardly on two legs through the shadows. Something alive, strange, and broken. Something that didn't belong. And I knew I would never forget the way it looked at me that night. Its golden eyes shining with cold awareness, its unnatural shape standing just beyond the reach of the moonlight. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a trick. It was real, and it was waiting. I had been planning this trip for months. After a long, grueling year in the city, with its noise and crowded streets, I needed to get away. I wanted silence, fresh air, and a chance to clear my head somewhere far from people. A friend of mine had a small cabin deep in the woods of a national forest. It was basic, no power, no running water, but that was exactly what I wanted. A break from modern life. I arrived late afternoon on a cool autumn day. The forest was already showing signs of change. Leaves were turning gold, red, and brown, carpeting the ground in dry, rustling piles. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall, thick pines and old oaks. I liked the smell of the place, earthy, damp, and sharp with pine needles. I unloaded my gear, stacked firewood, and got a fire going in the small stone fireplace inside the cabin. I set my bag by the bed and unpacked a few things. Some canned food, a flashlight, and my old hunting knife. I wasn't planning on hunting, but it felt right to have it with me, just in case. The first night was quiet except for the sounds of the forest. I fell asleep to the crackling of the fire and the gentle rustle of the wind through the trees. I woke just before dawn, restless. Outside, the world was still dark, but a faint gray light crept through the window. I stepped outside and breathed deeply. The air was crisp, cold enough to see my breath. The forest was silent except for the distant call of a lone crow. I spent the morning exploring nearby trails. The woods were thick and tangled, with fallen branches and moss-covered rocks. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. I saw signs of animals everywhere. Broken twigs, flattened grass, hoof prints in the soft mud. Mostly deer tracks and some smaller animals. That afternoon, I decided to rest back at the cabin. I sat on the porch watching the sun sink low behind the trees. Shadows grew long and cold. That night, I heard something strange. It started as a soft snapping of branches, then heavy footsteps moving slowly in the brush not far from the cabin. At first, I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, shining the beam into the woods. The light cut through the darkness, revealing a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the trees. The eyes were too high off the ground for a normal deer, and they weren't shaped quite right. I squinted, trying to make out the figure. Then it stepped forward into the clearing. It looked like a deer, but something was terribly wrong. Its body was the size of a large buck, but it stood almost upright, its back straight and legs bent at unnatural angles. Its head was like a deer's, with antlers reaching out crookedly, but its face was twisted and misshapen. The eyes were too large, too human in shape, and they gleamed with a sharp, calculating light. The fur was patchy, with clumps missing here and there. Its movements were jerky, like it wasn't used to walking on two legs but was trying hard to stay balanced. Took a few slow steps, almost testing its legs. I froze. The thing let out a low, guttural sound. Not a deer's call, but a harsh noise, like a growl mixed with a whine. It cocked its head and stared at me, unblinking. I backed slowly toward the cabin door, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature followed, stepping awkwardly but steadily into the clearing. The farther it came, the more unnatural it seemed. Its limbs twisting, the way it shifted weight unevenly. Once inside the cabin, I locked the door and turned on my flashlight. I scanned the windows, but the creature had stayed just outside, watching silently. For hours I sat near the fire, unable to sleep. Every sound outside made me jump. I kept my knife close and the rifle I had brought resting against the wall. The next day, I found strange tracks outside the cabin. They weren't quite deer tracks, too large with strange marks between the toes, as if the feet had fingers. They led around the cabin and disappeared into the forest. I spent the day in the cabin, too afraid to wander far. Every time I looked out, I saw movement between the trees, something watching, waiting. Night fell again, colder and darker. The creature returned. It circled the clearing, moving slowly, its eyes never leaving the cabin. At one point, it stood completely still and looked straight up at the window. I realized then that whatever this thing was, it wasn't wild in the normal sense. It was aware, intelligent maybe. It watched me like a predator studying its prey. Over the next few days, the visits continued. The creature became bolder, sometimes standing on two legs fully upright, other times moving on all fours. It didn't attack or try to break in, but its presence was constant and menacing. I tried to document everything, writing notes in a journal I kept in the cabin. I took photos from inside, though they were mostly blurry. I thought about calling for help, but there was no cell signal, and I didn't want to leave. Something about this place felt important, like I needed to understand what I was seeing. One night, I heard sounds I hadn't before, soft, dragging noises near the edge of the clearing. When I looked out, I saw multiple shapes in the shadows. More of those creatures, or maybe the same one moving in different forms. They were watching me, waiting. I started to see signs of damage around the cabin. Scratches on the wood, broken branches, and strange marks etched into the ground. The creatures weren't just passing through, they were marking territory. I realized I was trapped in a place where something had changed, where animals I thought I knew had transformed into something else. The fear settled deep in my bones. I stayed inside for days, rationing my food, barely sleeping. The creatures stayed close, their eyes burning through the night. On the last night, I heard the scraping sound at the door again. I looked out and saw the creature standing upright, its fur bristling, antlers sharp in the moonlight. It stared at me, and for the first time I felt like it understood me. Then it did something I hadn't expected. It raised a paw, not like a paw, more like a hand, and pressed it flat against the glass. There was a strange sadness in its eyes, a weight of something broken. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. I realized these creatures weren't monsters. They were animals, or once were animals, forced into a shape they never wanted. The forest had changed them. At dawn, I packed my gear in silence. I left the cabin locked behind me, the creatures watching quietly from the edge of the woods. I didn't look back. Driving away, I kept thinking about those eyes, watching, waiting, caught between two worlds. I knew that place, deep in the forest, was no longer just wilderness. It was a prison, and those creatures, whatever they were trapped inside it like me.